Hi everyone, this is Janice, your neighborhood nutritionist. I've spent the last couple of years helping busy office professionals upgrade their health through upgrading their nutrition. And one thing was very obvious. Nobody's got time to read up on all the scientific stuff to know fact from fiction. So each week, I will talk to you about a different topic or concept in nutrition in simple, everyday terms, so you are empowered to make the best nutritional decisions. Get ready to learn about some new stuff, gain new insights into old concepts, and super boost your health.
For those who may not be aware, 10th October was World Mental Health Day. While different countries have mental health awareness weeks at different times of the year, it really is something that affects us all over the world. According to mentalhealth.org.uk, anxiety and depression are the most common problems, with around 1 in 10 people affected at any one time. And between 1 and 2 in every 100 people experience a severe mental illness such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and have periods when they lose touch with reality. I'm really happy that I was able to record this episode on the relationship between mental health and nutrition. It was a really eye-opening conversation, bringing to light how important it is to get our nutrition right, whether you're just trying to feel better or are actively dealing with mental health issues. Okay, so today I've got the pleasure to speak with Diana, who is a health and nutrition coach with a specialization with anxiety. So thank you, Diana, for joining us today. And I think this is such a special and important topic, especially because we're recording in COVID times. And I think stress and anxiety are probably high for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you say that, because I've been getting an influx of people who I think are just completely overwhelmed by what's going on in the world.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't really help, having all of this news blasting in our faces every day about numbers and all of that. And we did have a little chat prior to this recording, but I know that you really specialize in mental health, and you have a really insightful view on how nutrition actually comes into this.
It really comes from personal experience, that's for sure. But I've seen such a major difference in people, and I'm sure you have as well, when they change their diet or their lifestyle, even subtle changes. I'm not talking about these major diets or fads or taking a handful of supplements every day, but those small changes really do make a difference in your mental health. And, talking about COVID times when we're all so stressed and anxious and our body's under so much stress from that anxiety, the only thing you can do is take care of yourself. And what better way to do that than with nutrition?
So if you don't mind, can you tell us a little bit more about your story, I guess, how you came to where you are now and, with this passion in mental health and nutrition?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I have quite an interesting story. And honestly, my experience with nutrition specifically started with the fact that both of my parents started the first holistic health center on the East Coast in New York. My dad is a psychologist and my mom is a nutritionist and a massage therapist. And so I was sort of born into this world, right? But what's really interesting is that my great-grandfather is the founder of Nathan's Famous, the hot dog company. And so it's like sort of a teeter on this weird world of being raised by a nutritionist who, always taught us to eat well, and then having a grandfather who fed me hot dogs, almost every single day. And so by the time I was 12 or 13, I was very overweight. I was actually about 100 pounds overweight. And I was having a lot of physical symptoms. I never was able to sleep. I would go to sleep and I'd wake up like 20 minutes later and just be completely unable to sleep at all. And I was a pretty, active kid despite my being overweight. I was always very active and involved. And I was a happy kid, but I would wake up in the middle of the night, not be able to go back to sleep. I'd wake up with these horrible, sharp pains in my stomach. And my parents, being holistic, they took me to an acupuncturist. And that was sort of where my understanding of how it would actually affect me came into play. Unfortunately, the acupuncture didn't really help fully, but it helped me to be more aware of what was actually going on. And what was actually going on was that a combination of eating the totally wrong foods and having a lot of
Mhm.
fear and a lot of anxiety. I was always so fearful of things that I think a lot of kids are fearful of, social anxiety, being in school. I was afraid of thunderstorms for a long time. And I actually had to face that one. And, we all had our little quirks, of course, but I think that combination really, really hit me hard. And I didn't know that these physical symptoms, that the fact that I couldn't sleep, or I would wake up with these terrible pains, or, even that I would see multiple doctors and the doctors would tell me, oh, maybe you're lactose intolerant, or, oh, just try
Mm.
this, and it was very blanketed. It wasn't relating my body. It wasn't telling me, you have a
Mhm.
physical issue that has been created by your emotional issues. Nobody thought about, my gosh, you're an anxious kid. You can't leave your parents without being concerned or fearful that they're going to get in a car accident. I had these like
Mhm.
ridiculous thoughts. I always did. Um, but it never was paired together. And so I was 15 years old and I started to do my own research. I was like one of those kids who spent my free time in the school library. I mean, it was rather odd, I think, at the time for most people looking at me. But I started to figure it out, and I started to make my own changes. I ended up losing 80 pounds. And after I lost that weight and I started to exercise, I started to eat a little bit better. And, don't get me wrong, I was 15, so I had my fair share of junk food. But, I just was more aware. I was more aware of what I was feeling. And I was more aware of how what I was feeling was affecting my physical health. Um, and I guess that's really kind of taken me here. And, now I work with a lot of people in that age bracket. I work with a lot of teens, or even like college age
Mm.
kids. And they're all in that period of, gosh, I don't know how to handle these things. Like, I don't want to go on this strict diet. I don't want to have to cut out my life.
Mhm.
So it's really interesting how it's kind of come full circle.
To start figuring that out at age 15 is pretty advanced. I mean, I guess in a very similar way, I also had similar symptoms in terms of my nutrition affecting my sleep. So before I started really looking at my nutrition, I would just be tired to a point where it was unreasonable. I just cannot understand why I'm so tired. And obviously, through fitness, through nutrition, I got over that as well. And I think it's really interesting, the way you pointed out the mind and body connection. Actually, it's not a new topic, but for some reason, when it comes to nutrition, I guess it's easier for people to believe in, hard science. Give me the numbers, give me the statistics. And I'm quite interested actually in hearing about, you mentioned in our previous conversation, you also do testing in terms of neurotransmitters, how people absorb nutrients. So how do they actually work, and what's the kind of, range of results that you've seen in people?
Yeah, so this is also not a super new topic. In fact, there's many large brands internationally that do neurotransmitter or even wellness testing. But what's really going on, and what I think is a big problem right now, is that the idea of your mental health affecting your physical health and vice versa has become sort of like a fad. It's this thing where it's cool to test your body, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you know what I mean, where like people are like, oh, let me take a quiz online, am I sick? I mean, it's like, how out of touch do you have to be with your body that you have to take a quiz to understand that something's
Mm.
not right? So I
Mm-hmm.
started to do a lot of research about labs and which of these fad labs were actually really understanding the person as a whole, because it's critical. If somebody's just ordering a test for $300 and, sending it into a lab, and the lab doesn't even know who that person is, then I don't
Mm-hmm.
see that being effective. So so I started to research, and I discovered a really amazing way to do it's at home. It's a urine sample. It's really easy to do at home. In fact, it's funny because I often will get parents who say, I want to do this for my kid who was diagnosed with ADHD, but he's 6. And I mean, let's be serious. A 6-year-old doing any of these things is hard. but, but it's very easy, and it's really fascinating because what it really shows us, and I think of it like astrology. You know, when you read your astrology chart and you're
Mm-hmm.
like, you're not expecting to hear these catastrophic answers to the world's problems, but what it does is it confirms for you, oh, that
Mm-hmm.
that might be why this is happening, or that explains that. And for most people, you know, like most testing, it's an explanation. It's helping them to
Mm-hmm.
understand, oh, I have terrible anxiety. I have been diagnosed several times in several different situations, but I don't really know why or what it's from.
Mm-hmm.
And so what it evaluates is all the neurotransmitters. So it evaluates 9 neurotransmitters, but it also evaluates how they're working together. So if you're not absorbing your nutrients properly, if you're not taking in the right foods or the right amount of water, if you're not getting the right type of sleep, it's not even that you're not getting enough sleep,
Mm-hmm.
it's the type of sleep. So it really evaluates all of those different pieces. And then what we do together is we actually sit down and say, all right, well, this is what's going on, and this is how we can best correct it. And what's really incredible, and I know we talked when we spoke before, we talked about, you know, amazing stories, and I
Mm-hmm.
even still get goosebumps to this day. But what's really incredible is the change that it's made on people's lives. I mean, the ability to get up in the morning, the ability to go to a
Mm-hmm.
job, things that we probably are like, oh, you know, you get up, you go to work.
That's the thing. So before I would call it fixing my own
Yeah,
body. I don't think I realized what it was like to wake up feeling fresh, right? And now I can't
exactly.
imagine going back to mornings of waking up. You know, sometimes you go to sleep and then it's like you wake up and you feel like it's been 3 seconds. And you're like, oh no, like I don't feel rested at all, but I need to start my day all over
Yeah.
again. And in fact, one thing I noticed, you know, when we used to pre-COVID times when we were in the office more, go around asking people, hey, how are you? And it's a mindset thing as well. But I've started to tell people, I'm great. How about you? Right? Whereas a lot of people by default would say, oh, I'm so busy, or like, not bad. You know, there's such a big switch when you get your sleep right. I reckon more and more people would say, feeling
Yeah.
great. And when you talk about neurotransmitters, perhaps for some of our listeners, could you explain some of the more common ones that people might have heard of? So, for example, a lot of people would have heard the headline of how, you know, sugar is as addictive as cocaine and it gives us a dopamine effect.
Yeah. So they're all connected. And I just want to say before I go on, because this is really important to understanding those neurotransmitters, when you talk about people asking, how are you? Or, you know, how's your day going? And you have that sort of routine. Now it might be a little bit different, but still, so when you're on group meetings or you're interacting with a group, you still would
Mm-hmm.
say, how are you doing? That's actually your neurotransmitters responding too. And when people automate so much that they say, oh, I'm good,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm fine, or even when they say, I'm busy, it's their body and their brain automating that response. And most of the time, it's because we're so tired that we don't even think twice about how we respond. And it's kind
Mm.
of sad a little bit when you think about it. But nonetheless, let's go into a little bit about this. So, yeah, all neurotransmitters work together. The two big ones that we always look at, and that, you know, if you're ever on anti anxiety medication, antidepressant medication, any medication that seeks to eliminate a behavior, so a mood, a response to your mood, all of those are affecting your dopamine and your serotonin. And both of those neurotransmitters are messengers to the brain. So they're communicating those feelings. And what those pills, or what those, you know, those prescriptions aim to do is to block those messengers. It's to block what those messengers aim to do. And they have so many different functions in the body. And so what often happens is people think of dopamine or serotonin independently, but there are so many different types of neurotransmitters. The main ones that we really look at, like I said, are serotonin and dopamine. And both of those really process all your hormones. They process your metabolism, your sleep, really everything, your endorphins, so how much energy you might have, how able you are to be really present in a moment. But what really relates to those things are then epinephrine and norepinephrine, which those are like your excitatory. Those are the things that get you really anxious. So most people know those as adrenaline. And so when you have a ton of adrenaline running through your body, your norepinephrine and epinephrine are normally pretty out of whack. And those are all affected by your serotonin and your dopamine. So whenever somebody asks me to explain neurotransmitters, I try not to get too geeky with it and get all scientific and use all this weird jargon. But what's really important to know is all of those things stem from your stomach. So whatever you eat, however you eat, and that's important too, those will all affect your serotonin and your dopamine. In fact, 90% of your serotonin is actually in your stomach, not in your brain. And so if you can regulate your serotonin and your dopamine, the rest of the neurotransmitters will generally, unless you have severe allergies, because then your histamine is a little bit off. But unless you have any sort of really serious physical health issue, if you can balance the dopamine and the serotonin in your body, in your gut, then your brain generally follows.
I mean, I didn't know that 90% of serotonin is in our stomachs. That's super interesting because a lot of the times when people think about mental health, think about, moods or feelings, they think, oh, it must be the brain as the command center.
Yeah.
But actually our bodies are like this, really crazy, complicated network of loads of things together. And effectively, the way you've described it, I would say neurotransmitters are kind of like a traffic light system that signals everything else in our bodies, right? So it totally makes sense that if that is not balanced, then, I know some people have, weight gain problems, or some even have problems putting on weight, right? There are people with poor absorption. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually. And when we talk about, I guess, extending further into the whole feelings and how we eat, has that got anything to do with disordered eating? Because, from a biological point of view, I'm sure our bodies actually send plenty of signals to say either A, you're not eating enough, or B, you're eating too much, right? Which under normal circumstances, we know.
Yeah.
We know that stomach growling feeling, or we know that beached whale feeling. But I guess when these things, get off kilter, then is that what informs the brain incorrectly?
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. In fact, it's funny you say that. For a long time, I would say maybe 10 years ago, many of the large organizations like the National Eating Disorders Association, Renfrew, which is a very large center here in the United States, those organizations were starting to look at how these neurotransmitters were actually linked to eating and specifically to disorders. And there's a ton of research about it. In fact, they found that there's actually fundamental differences in the actual brains of the people who have anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder. And it comes back to that reward center. So I remember when we spoke last, you were talking about why people didn't want to go on diets. And it's because people want to be happy, right? I know you talked about that. And that's such a phenomenal point. And it's I think also why we both don't believe in dieting. But it's the same thing. So, with eating disorders, the brain it doesn't function properly in terms of how it regulates our rewards. It doesn't associate feeding with a reward. It doesn't associate energy even with a reward. And that's where our food comes from. We eat for energy. We eat to live. But when you have an eating disorder, or even if you just deal with emotional eating, which is something that I really struggled with myself, I'm sure a lot of us, even I would say, are struggling right now with. I think you actually mentioned that. So when you're stressed, you either eat a lot or you can't eat at all. And it's that same thing. So any kind of disordered eating, whether it be a diagnosed condition like anorexia, binge eating, or bulimia, will then directly correlate to your serotonin, your dopamine, any kind of basis for that happiness response, because those are our happiness hormones. And we want to make sure that those are regulated. So absolutely, anytime your body's out of whack to that extent, it's definitely going to be impacted by the neurotransmitters.
At the moment, with COVID and the whole world going crazy, basically, I know a lot of people are experiencing more than usual levels of anxiety and depression. Could you explain a little bit about how that actually works, in terms of neurotransmitters, and what is anxiety and what is depression?
Actually. So both are stress responses. So when your body's under stress, it reacts, and it will react in a way that either will be exposed as depression or as anxiety. So you might have heard, and I'm sure many of your listeners might have heard, that oftentimes people who have anxiety might also have bouts of depression, and vice versa. It's very, very common. And it's really because those sorts of mood disorders are stress responses. When your body is under stress, it creates a response. And, relating it back to nutrition and relating it back to these neurotransmitters, your body is actually inflamed. So, we all know about cortisol. Cortisol is this stress hormone, as many people would say. It's the reason we all have belly fat, I guess, is the more common dietitian world of saying it. But cortisol is an inflammation. Cortisol is your body's response to that stress hormone coming out in droves. And so when we have that stress hormone, oftentimes when we do these tests with people, and when I have somebody who has anxiety or depression, we want to understand how the cortisol in their body is affecting their neurotransmitters, because anxiety and depression is really just a response to stress. And so, like you said, during these times when the world seems like it's just absolutely destroyed and we don't know what to do or how to respond, our bodies know what to do. They'll respond by creating stress, by creating inflammation, by sending that alarm. And it really is, it's funny because people look at anxiety as this thing that we suffer with. Depression is something that we suffer with, but the body was created to experience anxiety and depression. These are normal responses. It's your body's way of protecting you from stress. So, we want to be able to really look at what's going on in the world and look at what's going on with your chemicals in your body, with whatever imbalances are in your body, and with the way that your body is responding to stress with some level of understanding. We have to say the world is really crazy right now. The world is very stressful right now. So if you are feeling anxious, if you're feeling depressed, to some extent, that's very normal. You should. It's very scary. But it's when that stress begins to take a toll on our body, so much so that we don't know how to respond, to where our body becomes overwhelmed. That's when that dopamine, that's when that serotonin starts to really attack the body. And that's when your anxiety and depression begins to really, just go wild.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, things like anxiety, right? If you think back to old times when we had lions chasing us, that is a very useful thing, actually, instead of being super chilled and sitting there waiting for the lion to come at you. And I think that's a much healthier and much more constructive way to look at anxiety and depression, instead of just, these dreadful things that we suffer from. Instead, they are actually normal responses, biological responses as humans, but let's learn how to kind of get over them, how to deal with them in a way so that we can still live our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And all the talk about stress and anxiety, it made me wonder if that is why food is always so much tastier when we're on holiday. Because there is no stress, usually there is no stress in the picture. And I wonder if that makes everything seem better. And our bodies, taste buds, everything just are happier.
So I had a client once who was very stressed by her family, who really hated the idea of holidays because it meant all of this time with people that gave her a lot of anxiety. It was almost like the opposite of what you're saying. But what was interesting is it's interesting, but what she used to do to feel better was eat an entire pie. And that kind of gluttonous,
Okay.
yeah. So she would just kind of go to town and eat a whole pie. And that kind of gluttonous sort of binge eating would still release this happiness hormone. So you're absolutely right. When the body feels more relaxed, more at ease, we feel more open to be able to eat the foods we love, indulge. There's also that thought process like, this food doesn't count. We often go through that like, oh, it's one night. We're just going to eat and drink whenever we want. But that still, just that thought alone releases a happiness hormone. So there's absolutely that correlation, no doubt in my mind. And, you're validating it.
And that's what you said about that, because it's like a party, it doesn't count, is such an interesting and very flawed way of thinking that we all have, right? I mean, even though I'm very, very, mindful of my nutrition, when it's my birthday, I'm going to eat cake, right?
Of course.
It's one of those things. And this is what I also, talk to my clients about in terms of not polarizing eating as an activity too much. Because if you demonize certain things and, put others on a pedestal, then, the idea of superfoods or food is not either only good or bad for you in most cases, unless you eat, I don't know, cyanide, then you will die. But, right, under normal circumstances, if it was someone's birthday, you're celebrating, you have a glass of wine, you have a donut, whatever your choice is not the end of the world. And I think it's that concept of eat this, not that is making it very hard for people to make any progress. Because, I was reading, if you heard my previous episode, I was just talking about someone who went on this really strict calorie restrictive diet and then fell off the wagon and put it all back on. Right? And I would imagine that you losing that much weight in that amount of time and putting everything back on probably isn't a very healthy thing for your body anyway, or for your mind, because you would be completely obsessed with controlling your food one day, and then you would feel the shame, the guilt, the disappointment in yourself the minute you can't hold up to it.
Yeah. And it's funny because I think now with so many different types of diets out there that are completely based on the idea that you do this for 30 days or for whatever it is, it's like you're challenging your body to see, how long can I torture myself to lose the weight I want, just so that when I'm done with this 30-day challenge or 45-day or whatever it is, I have to have this mindset like, okay, I'm done. And what do you think your body wants when it finishes a challenge? It wants a reward. And that reward is not another 30 days of a keto diet. It's eating. It's eating. We always associate reward with food. And you're right. We cannot continue to prioritize food in this way where we have to challenge ourselves to eat a certain way for a certain amount of time. It should be more of, like you said, it's my birthday, I want a slice of cake. That's fine. That's normal. Of course, that's fine. We don't have to eliminate cake. We don't have to find alternatives to things that we enjoy. I think that's
that's one of my pet hates, when there are artificial products created to simulate certain things, because unless you are actually, for example, celiac, or you have an actual health condition where you need to find alternatives, because as long as we are eating what naturally comes from the earth, I really believe that it's not going to kill you, right? But when you start eating things that are artificially created, where you can't pronounce their names, you don't know what the ingredients are, or the ingredients list is, like 50 things. And honestly, I'm not sure how much research has gone into looking at, in 10 years, what happens to your body, right? Because the food industry is a powerful engine that keeps evolving daily. I think it's really important, on the topic of mental health, without even going into the realms of anxiety, depression, or other mental health disorders, it's so important for people to just be more connected with themselves mentally. That autopilot, it's good and bad, isn't it? Because sometimes we do need autopilot. I don't know if you read the book Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yes, I have.
It does help to do split thinking, but at the same time, I go as far as telling my clients, I'm not saying don't drink coffee. I personally don't like it because I have a child's palate and I don't like anything bitter. And I understand a lot of people out there love the aroma, the flavor of coffee, but be very mindful of the false sense of fullness or energy that coffee gives you, or not even coffee, caffeine generally in energy drinks, because while your body is stimulated to think that you're not tired, you didn't have any nutrients to actually feed your body. Yeah. So I do remind my clients, be mindful of how much coffee you're having every day and try to connect the dots, right? Are you having coffee because you don't eat anything? Or do you have it because you want to have it? Right? That's two very different things.
And I think too, what you're saying is that when your body is stressed, or if you're quick, like let's say you're really, really busy, it's very easy to grab a cup of coffee and keep going because you feel this need to keep going. But ultimately that leads to a lot more issues down the road because you're not connecting to what your body actually needs. And that's kind of how mental health issues kind of come into play. I mean, any kind of stress-related disorder, anything that relates to even substance-related disorders. I don't know if you knew this, but there's a thing called caffeine disorder. And it all stems from this feeling like you're replacing. You have to replace it.
Right. So it's basically a dependence that you are consciously trying to replace.
Yeah.
I guess in a way it is an addiction, isn't it? It might not sound as serious as like a drug addiction, but I've heard so many people, just casually say, oh, I'm addicted to sugar. Right. And I think, I don't want to be an alarmist. I don't want to call everything an addiction. Everything's a poison. It's not that at all. But I encourage people always to be a bit more positive and a bit more kind to themselves, instead of always saying, oh, yeah, I'm just going to be unhealthy because I can't stick to a diet, or, just a lot of blame going on. And
absolutely. And well, what you just said is where nutrition and mental health merge. It's in being able to revisit who you really are and what you really need. And to recognize that, I have a sweet tooth. Sure, I love coffee, but it comes from the fact that when I'm stressed, or when I was overwhelmed, or when I was tired, I would feed my body 5 cups of coffee, or I would want a cupcake because I was, it feels good, or, you have to connect back to something. And that's that reward center that we have to be reminded of sometimes, that, we're human, and that's okay. It doesn't, You're not perfect. You don't have to eat perfectly, but we do have to remember that feeding your mind and feeding your body, again, comes from a place of need. And so when your body craves something, if you love sweets or you love coffee or if you love, a glass of scotch
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, it's coming from somewhere. And it's not just, that you're stressed. It's coming from someplace else. There's a reason behind every craving. And anything hereditary can be treated. It doesn't, you don't have this life sentence. If a family member was sick,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to be sick too. So I think just to remind ourselves of that and to connect back to the reality of who we are is important.
Yeah, 100%. I guess, to round this up, can you give us maybe 3 actionable steps that our listeners can go away and immediately try out to feel better?
Yeah, absolutely. So my absolute number one thing that I recommend to people is to find what brings you joy. And I know that sounds kind of like commonplace, right? Of course, we all want to feel joy.
It's a bit Marie
It's
Kondo.
very Marie Kondo, it is, but let me expand for a second because it's not what you might think. It's, we just talked about it a little bit. If you have a sweet tooth, if you love having a glass of scotch at the end of the day, if you love coffee, find that response and that what brings you that joy, and don't eliminate it, but start to plan for it and really record how your
Mm-hmm.
body feels. So the first thing I do with people is to take that thing that brings you joy and record how your body reacts to it. It's really, really important that we at least know that if I want to have something, this is what will happen when I do. And that you can
Mm-hmm.
almost prepare for it. So that's my number one tip. Absolutely, like, very, very important. I think it makes a huge difference when you're aware of your body. My number two tip is to start to just replace one thing a day. So if you
Mm-hmm.
have a go-to breakfast, if drink 5 cups of coffee a day, like I used to, guilty, just start to replace 1 cup with a cup of tea, or replace
Mm-hmm.
one meal with something that is a little bit more healthy or more conducive to give you energy, especially if it's during the day and you're active. So that would be my number two. And I would say my number three action step is honestly to get outside. And that seems, again, very simple, that might even kind of sound a little bit Marie Kondo there. But what I mean to say is that the more that we can connect with our environment, the more aware we are of our bodies. And oftentimes when we're sitting at a
Mm-hmm.
desk, when we're staring at a computer, when we're on the phone a lot, we lose touch with how we
Mm-hmm.
actually feel. And you would be shocked at how many clients I have that felt really ill or had a lot of symptoms, and their symptoms were simply coming from the fact that they weren't fully aware they were having them. And it wasn't until they got
Mm-hmm.
home and they took a shower and they got in bed for the night that they felt that stomach ache, that headache, whatever twinge or
Yeah.
pain. They were just completely unconscious. So if we can get outside and be in a different environment, that is extraordinarily helpful. And just very quick to piggyback on that, because I think this is a really excellent example of it. I had a client who had
Mm-hmm.
terrible vertigo, terrible vertigo. He couldn't leave his house. He was like he just completely could not function. We started to
Mm-hmm.
evaluate how his body reacted to the different foods he was eating. He went outside a little bit. He was actually a professor. And within 3 months of doing testing and just changing little things, his vertigo was 100% gone. He completely eliminated all of his medications. It was really outstanding. I mean, I was blown away. But it really just shows what we talked about, that we have to be more in touch with ourselves and more connected to our
Mm-hmm.
mind and our body.
And especially now when everybody is indoors so much, I'm sure a lot of listeners know this as well, but daylight and how your body produces serotonin and blue light from monitors and everything, that really takes us out of whack, because I could sit here and it would feel the same if it were 8 in the morning and 10 in the
Yes.
evening. I definitely feel a difference when you go outside, you feel the outside air on your skin. And I always say this to people, you cannot feel bad when you've got the sun on your face. Like, it's just impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And I would challenge anyone listening to try, if you're feeling bad, go put your face in the sun. You're going to feel better. It's just impossible.
It's true. It's true. And it's so funny you say that too, because it brings out so much of those happy neurotransmitters, those happiness hormones, and it makes you feel more aware of those imbalances. So, you know, I urge your listeners to be really aware of those symptoms. If you have that lack of energy, if you're feeling really depleted, if you're feeling, you know, restless, if you have that inability to sleep, if you have sadness, if you have that feeling of emptiness, or connected to nutrition, if you're overeating or have a loss of appetite, those are all connected to those imbalances in your neurotransmitters. And so the moment we step outside and we get some fresh air and we get some sunlight and just kind of reset, we can be more aware of those feelings.
Yeah, and if anyone needs any more convincing about this connection, just think back to those nights when you finally get to go to bed and your body relaxes into your mattress and suddenly your back hurts like you're 80 years old, right? Or when you have a, you know, long deserved holiday after months and months of, you know, home working, extra meetings, extra hours, and you get sick, right? So if anyone needs any more convincing, just think about those scenarios. Yeah. And Diana, it's been an amazing chat. One last question from me that I ask all my guests. Yeah. What is the one food that always takes you to your happy place?
I love this question so much. And it's funny because I feel like I have 25 foods that just bring me so much joy. Because I love food so much. But my food is ironically healthy, because also cupcakes and deliciousness takes me to my happy place in so many other ways. But my one food is raspberries. And the reason for that is
interesting.
Yeah. And it's because my grandmother, who was my biggest fan, my best friend, loves them to death. And they actually had a giant raspberry bush, I guess it's a bush, on their property that we used to get to pick together. So I have fond memories of these raspberries.
If you're concerned that you are developing a mental health problem, you should seek the advice and support of your GP as a matter of priority. If you are in distress and need immediate help and are unable to see a GP, you should visit your local A&E. You will also find some resources listed in the show notes. And that's it for this episode of Neighbourhood Nutritionist. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I hope you've really enjoyed it and learned something you can take away with you today. If you could take a second to share this episode with one person you think will love it, that would be absolutely amazing. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening now. See you soon!